Please welcome Dr. Stu Hill.
Thank you. I made about 50 copies of a pamphlet that I wrote a long time ago that's still pretty accurate. Many of you have them, many of you don't. Find somebody who has one and make a copy if you want it. You go ahead and copy away. One of the other reasons I say that is that a lot of the texts I'm going to talk about are actually in the pamphlet, and I was hoping that most people would have access to one because I did one of the cardinal sins of PowerPoint, which is put too many words on one slide. So those of you who are in my classes and I told you never to do this, please note I'm doing it, but I realize I shouldn't have. But I didn't want to take 5 slides to do something. So that's how that works. You'll see what I'm talking about when I get there. So I've been giving this talk for a number of years, and part of the reason that I do it is that a lot of information out in the world in general about homosexuality in the Bible, I think is not entirely accurate. And so I think it's really important for people to have as much information about this topic as they possibly can. And I'm also aware that people have very strong feelings about this topic, and I don't actually have any intention of trying to change your minds or fight with you about it or any of that stuff. I really am interested in giving you a perspective that you may not have heard before. This topic becomes really important because homosexuality is one of the biggest and most divisive issues in churches today. The Episcopal Church, for instance, recently split because of this issue. The question of gay clergy in many mainstream denominations is currently a really big issue. And so lots and lots of people are having discussions and debates about this particular issue. So I think it's really important that we spend some time thinking about it. The other thing that I'm very well aware of is that people's ideas about homosexuality come from a variety of places, and they're usually pretty strong. People usually have pretty clear ideas about what they think about it one way or the other. And we get them from lots of places. We get them from churches, we get them from our families, we get them from the communities that we live in. And most, well, not most, but a lot of churches suggest that homosexuality is a sin and that it is not an acceptable form of sexuality. There are lots and lots of reasons for that, one of them being what people think is in the Bible. But there are other issues about that too that have to do with definitions of marriage, that have to do with ideas of appropriate family life within the context of society, how people have constructed these things over the years. So it's just a recognition that we get these ideas from a lot of different places. Okay, so some things that I'd like you to consider. There are 5 references in the Bible about homosexuality. Now, you can make these a little more. You can add a few more to it if you add references to these passages. But there aren't that many. And I'll talk about these. But one of the things that I think is really, really important to consider, and this will engage all of your critical thinking skills, which is one of the things you're supposed to be doing in college, is 5 passages enough to make the kind of claims that people make in the kind of forceful ways that people make them. So just to give you a couple of other examples. There aren't very many. There are, for example, 37 references, just that, to the condemnation of adultery. And yet we don't kick adulterers out of most churches, and we don't make the same kinds of claims about people who are adulterers. Yet it's very clear that in the biblical context, adultery is a much bigger deal. That is, people spend more time talking about it than they talk about homosexuality. So it's just something to consider. There's no clear condemnation of lesbian sex in the Bible. You can make of that whatever you wish. There's one passage in Romans that might refer to that, but most of the other passages don't consider women at all. The other thing I think is really, really important is that we live in a world, a post-Freudian world, where we have a very clear notion that we have sexual identities, that it's part of who we are as people. So that we have certain proclivities and desires for people of the same or others or a different sex, and we understand the idea of sexual orientation. This is not the case in the ancient world in the same way. That is not to say that people always haven't had certain sexual desires and all sorts of sexual desires. It's just that they didn't label them in the way that we do. So, for instance, if you lived in ancient Greece or at the time of the Bible, there were no words in any of the languages that translated into what we would call homosexual, heterosexual, bisexual, any of those things that we are pretty attached to today. So what I think this means is that while they have certain ideas, while all cultures have ideas about sexuality and proper sexuality and improper sexuality, etc., it wasn't uncommon, for instance, in the ancient Greek world, for men to have relationships with both men and women and not to consider themselves bisexual. That wasn't what it meant. It just meant that that's what people did. So that's the first thing to say is that if you find a Bible with the word homosexual translated in it, there is no word in a language that the Bible was written in that translates into that word. And I'll talk more about this in a little while, but that's something that I think we need to kind of keep in mind. They're living in a really different context in the world than we are. There are also no passages in the Bible that specifically and affirmatively say, go homosexuals. People have made things out of the relationship between Jonathan and David and Ruth and Esther, and people have made those kinds of claims and comments. There are lots of queer theologians who talk about how the Bible can be made to be seen as queer positive, and I don't have any issues with that, but it is, I think, too much of it's an overstatement to say that the Bible affirms the relationships that we would today consider to be, in some contexts, by many of us, to be fine. So that's one thing, I'm clear about that. I would never want to make that claim. Okay, so these kinds of considerations lead us to thinking about how it is that people actually read the Bible. And you may think that this is kind of a long-winded way of getting at the real topic, but how people read the Bible is absolutely relevant to understanding how people are going to think about homosexuality. So a lot of people talk about literalness in the Bible, that if you just read the words literally, that this is what you get. That they're easy to understand, that we just need to take them at face value, that's all there is to it. And I have to say that I'm always a little bit puzzled by this because we always interpret when we use language. When somebody makes any one of these kinds of claims, he's not playing with full deck, she's out in left field, there are only really specific contexts in which those statements can be taken literally. Playing cards and cheating, or playing baseball. But we know what those mean, right? We know that those, if you're a native English speaker and you have a good facility with metaphor and stuff in our language, you understand that those mean, he's not playing with full deck, he's a little off, he's a little crazy, he doesn't understand what's going on, or she's out in left field, that's the same thing. Those are two phrases for that. The other thing that I like to point out is that Jesus himself is the master of symbolism. Jesus speaks in metaphor and parable all the time. Do you think that Jesus is really talking about mustard seeds in the New Testament when he tells the parable of the mustard seed? He's not. And everyone who reads that knows that. That's not a literal reading. Jesus was really talking about mustard seeds. So you need to kind of think about that as you understand how it is that people read what it is that's going on in any text, not just the Bible, in any text. The most common way that people, there are lots of ways to read the Bible. The most common way that people have engagement with the Bible is as believers, and that is one very important way of engaging the text. Another way to do it is as a biblical scholar, and biblical scholars tend to see this document tend to see the Bible as a historical document that tells us a lot about the people who were living at the time, about how they understood their relationship with God, and how they conceived it and wrote it down. This particular way of thinking about the Bible, that it reflects the cultures in which it was written, so it's important for us to kind of understand the culture in which it's written and what same-sex acts might have meant to them. This is the way that all of the major Christian denominations agree that this is the way that you should read the biblical text. So I am not, in fact, out on a limb here when I'm talking this way. Most of the major, in fact, I guess I would say all of the major denominations affirm this particular way to read the text. They may still have other reasons to think differently about the text, but reading the text from a historical, critical perspective is not an unusual thing to do, even in the context of denominational theologies. Okay, so given that kind of background, let's just take the passages as they are and think about them. Okay, so the Old Testament, or the Hebrew Bible, has a couple of passages. So Leviticus 18:22. I think this passage is in the pamphlet on page 14 or so. That's where the passages start. So Leviticus 18:22 is where the famous passage about do not lie with a man as one lies with a woman. That is detestable, or it is an abomination. You will notice here that I have some different translations here. So KJV is the King James Version. That's the version that most Catholics use. The New International Version is another version that is used. Oh, crap. Sorry, excuse me. I have my power cord. I'll just plug it in. So you can see that these words that we tend to translate in particular ways have different meanings. It's different to say confusion than it is to say perversion. We think of those words very differently. So if you were to line up even all the ways in which these words are translated, you would get a lot of different implications about what those things meant. Okay, so Leviticus is a text that is about a set of codes that the ancient Israelites, who were the first to make a covenant relationship with God, it's their code. It's the code that God has given them about how to act and what they should and shouldn't do. Notice the language here, and notice what's around it. So don't have sexual relations with your neighbor's wife. So this is primarily written to men, because having sexual relations with your neighbor's wife is really something that men shouldn't do. There's no assumption here that that there's a conversation happening with women. Don't give any of your children to be sacrificed to Molech, who's a pesky Canaanite god next door. You don't want that to happen. Do not lie with a man as one lies with a woman. Now the way that is stated is really crucial, and I'll talk about that in a minute. Don't have sexual relations with an animal. Both men and women don't get to do that. Don't defile yourself in any of these ways, because this is how the nations I'm going to drive out before you became defiled. Okay, so don't do these things. They're not good. And I want you to notice, I will never forget this, because it was one of the best teaching moments I've ever experienced. When one of my students, we were looking at this passage in a class, and one of my students raised his hand and said, well, what if you lie with a man like he's a man? And I thought, well, that's really interesting because that really gets at an assumption of this text. Do not lie with a man as one lies with a woman. There's an assumption there about what sex would be between two men. That one of them would have to pretend as though he were a woman. In this culture, being a woman is not a good thing. You are property. You are owned by your husband and by your father before him. And it is not, in fact, a good thing for a man to pretend as though he is a woman. That's the prohibition here. And there's an assumption about the kind of sex that would happen when that, in fact, happens. It is true. There is, in fact, a prohibition against this. But there are prohibitions about a whole lot of things in Leviticus. So a little bit about Leviticus. When God makes the covenant with the Israelites, it's a covenant that says, okay, here are the rules that you need to follow, and if you follow these rules, this is how this is going to be for you. If you don't follow these rules, there are certain kinds of consequences for them. And so there is an idea within this context of purity. And I put another passage from Leviticus. There is a lot of distinction, if you read Leviticus and Deuteronomy, a lot of distinctions between things that are clean and things that are unclean. And these are categories that are not really, they're rational within the system. They may not seem rational to us when we read them, but they're rational within the system, and they are codes and impurities and purities that help to distinguish and demarcate the culture. So, you are to be holy to me because I, the Lord, am holy and have set you apart from the nations to be my own. So that's God talking to the Hebrews, to the Israelites, and making those distinctions. Now, in the Levitical codes, which are really purity codes, there are two different kinds of purity. There's the purity that you automatically, there's purity that, there's purity about you being a nation, and there's purity of individuals. And there's a recognition in this context that there are things that are going to make you impure on a daily basis, and then there are rituals to make you pure again. For instance, it makes you impure to touch a body that is dead. But in a community, somebody has to do that when people die. So there's a recognition that when you touch that body, when you deal with that body, prepare that body for burial, that you will become unclean. So here then, says Leviticus in various points, are the rituals that you do to become clean again. So this idea of purity and cleanliness is something that we have to take into account. We don't think about it in quite the same way, though I have to say that we do have purity codes, and I will just say, let's all go eat our lunch in the bathroom. And people go, ew. And that's what purity codes are. When you find yourself going, ew, that's a purity code. It doesn't make people immoral who would do it. You'd think they might be a little strange, but you're not going to say, wow, that's a really simple person. They went and ate their lunch in the bathroom. And I go, I don't know about their judgment, but it doesn't, and purity doesn't necessarily reflect on your moral character. That's one thing that you need to kind of understand about this. So when Leviticus talks about abominations and about confusions and perversions, these are impurities. So they get caught up in morality a little bit, but they're not just about morality. I talk about this more in the pamphlet and hopefully clarify it some. It's very complicated. We spent, 3 weeks in class talking about purity? So it's much more complicated than the 5-minute talk I can give about that, but it's operating here. The other thing about purity is that purity is about being pure and whole before God. So that's why women menstruating are impure, because they're leaking. Injuries make you leak. If you spill your semen unintentionally and in the wrong way, you are impure because you are leaking in an inappropriate kind of way. So you can't mix kinds, says God, and you can't do things like mate 2 different kinds of animals. You can't plant your field with 2 kinds of seeds. You can't wear clothing woven of 2 kinds of material. These same laws are in Leviticus in the same passage, mean the same thing, are as important as everything else. So one of the things to think about here is that if you're going to, for an ancient Israelite to pull out a couple of passages from Leviticus and say, we should pay attention to these really importantly, but we're going to ignore the rest of them, would have been unthinkable. You either take them all as a piece, or you don't take any of them. So when we pull out passages from Leviticus to justify social and cultural ideas, we tend to ignore things like clothing woven of two kinds of material. I don't think the people who talk about Leviticus 18 are really concerned with not wearing cotton polyester blends. And frankly, that's what we're talking about here. So you either have to take it all or you take none of it. But if you list out certain passages because you want to make them more important than the rest of them, that's not what the biblical text would want you to do. It's not what those purity codes were about. So that's a challenge, I think. Now, this is one of those bad slides. This is the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. I know it's a bad slide. I'm sorry, but it would have taken 5 slides. Okay. So I'm hoping that many of you understand the story. The story of Sodom and Gomorrah is the story where Sodom and Gomorrah are these horrible cities, and God decides to destroy them all except for the righteous man Lot. And 2 strangers go to Sodom, and nobody knows who they are. They knock on Lot's door, and he takes them in as strangers and says, and then some of the Sodomites come and they knock on the door and they say, give those men to us, we want to have sex with them. And it depends on the translation. The biblical no. And so Lot says, no, I'm not going to give you the strangers. You can have my daughters, though. Now, for me, that's a really problematic passage here. And I understand that would have been actually a perfectly reasonable response for Lot to make in his time. But that's not what people focus on here. They focus on the fact that the Sodomites want to have sex with Lot's strangers. And Lot says, no, please take my daughters instead. Now, the thing that's really interesting about this passage is that it's this passage that creates the word sodomite. This idea that the angels who knock on Lot's door, that what's being prohibited here, or what's being argued against here, is about homosexual sex, is an interesting argument, because I think that pretty much everybody could in fact suggest that raping, whether it be heterosexual or homosexual, could in fact be something that the Bible would be against. But the thing about this passage, and what is interesting about this passage, is that when other people in the Bible refer to this passage, which would suggest how people who know the story in the cultural context are reading the passage, they never talk about homosexuality. It is not what they care about. They care about hospitality. So, for instance, in Ezekiel, the reference to the sister Sodom and her daughters, they were arrogant, overfed, unconcerned. They did not help the poor and needy. There's nothing in there about them being homosexuals. It's about them being inhospitable. It's about them not helping their neighbors. It's about them not doing what they were supposed to do as a good society. When Jesus talks about Sodom and Gomorrah in Matthew, he talks about it and said he's sending the disciples out to preach. And he says, if anyone will not welcome you or listen to your words, shake the dust off your feet when you leave that town, home or town. I tell you the truth, it will be more bearable for Sodom and Gomorrah on the day of judgment than for that town. That's about the towns being hospitable to the people who are coming to talk to them. This was a culture in which hospitality was crucial. If you're stuck in the middle of the desert, you need somebody to take you in, or you might die. So treating strangers correctly and being hospitable and having hospitality was incredibly important in this culture. We tend to ignore this particular aspect of this story because of years and years and years and years of theological readings of this story that didn't pay any attention to the hospitality aspect of it. But if the Bible itself, when it reads Sodom and Gomorrah, references it that way, and there are no references in the Bible itself about this story being about homosexuality, I think we have to kind of think about what is it that this story is supposed to mean for us. Okay, another bad one. The New Testament. The Romans passage, this is also, I think it's on page 15 or 16 in your passage, in the pamphlet. The New Testament stuff is complicated. This is a passage from Paul's letter to the Romans. And it's the most difficult passage to explain, I have to say. It would probably take me a good hour to do it justice. I'll try to be quick. Though I do have a good lead amount of time. Wow, I'm speeding through. Okay, so Paul. Here's the deal with Paul. So Paul is living right at the time after Jesus dies in the 1st century. And Paul is wandering around to very many places in the Roman Empire, establishing little house churches. So Paul goes to Rome, he goes to Corinth, he goes to Ephesus, he goes to Galatia, he goes to all these places. And you have to remember there are no telephones, there's no postal service, there's no way that people can get a hold of each other. So he goes to these places, he establishes these churches. Now, one of the things that's very interesting about these churches that he's established is that in the book of Mark and in a lot of the kind of documents about Jesus' ministry, it says that Jesus told everybody, told the disciples, go preach to all nations. Now, this would have been very strange because of things like the Levitical codes, the ancient Israelites, Hebrews, Jews, the people we're now talking about in the New Testament, had spent hundreds and hundreds of years trying to separate themselves off from the cultures around them because God told them to, frankly, right? Those passages suggest I'm separating you off from the rest of the nations. You are the people with whom I am in covenant. So then Jesus says, oh, by the way, not just for Jews, for everybody, which is a little shocking. And so Paul goes around. Paul believes that Jesus is going to come back in his own lifetime, which causes a number of problems for Paul and for the later church. And Paul then periodically, clearly, because we have these letters, gets word from his communities that are made up of Jews who believe that Jesus is the Messiah. They're still Jews. They're still law-abiding. They're still taking care of the covenant and doing that stuff because they believe that Jesus is the Messiah that's predicted for them. They believe that he's the fulfillment of the covenant. And you have a bunch of Gentiles who find the message that is being preached to be really, really appealing. So Paul is creating these small house churches, and he's wandering around, and he's talking to them. And then periodically he clearly gets notice from them that they're having some issues. The two big issues in Paul's community is who you eat with and whether you should circumcise your men. Now, these are issues that we don't care about at all, but they were big issues for Paul. They were issues because the question of circumcision, for instance, all Jewish male babies are circumcised. According to the covenant, it's a religious rule. So if you're going to become a Christian, they're not calling themselves Christians yet. If you're going to become a Jew, basically, by believing that this is Jesus the Messiah, who was a Jew, do you have to actually become a Jew in order to be a Jew? Do you have to keep the covenant? Do you have to keep all the food rules? Do you have to keep all of those rules in Leviticus? Or, heaven forbid, are we picking and choosing? Like, what is going on here? How do we think about this law? And Paul was a Pharisee. Paul was steeped in Jewish law. He knew Jewish law, and he converted to Christianity. So he knew both sides of the deal. And so when he was writing these letters to his communities, Rome, the Romans, Galatia, Galatians, Corinth, Corinthians, So if you really want to know what's going on in the very earliest church, read Paul's letters. Those are the earliest documents we have of what that church looked like. And if you read these letters, you will notice, the first thing you will notice if you read them carefully is that Paul, he's a really good arguer. And he's a really good rhetorician. He knows how to make a case. And what he tends to do, his kind of standard protocol, is to kind of say to people, look at you. Look at how fabulous and wonderful you are. Look at all these really great things you do, and look at how awesome you are. And then say to them, well, I know you think you're really great, and you are, but there's this other side of things over here, and they're really great too. So then he talks to the other side. He says how great they are, and how awesome they are, and what needs to happen, and all of that kind of stuff. And then he inevitably says, at some point, and I suspect every letter, though I'm not going to bet on that, people, I don't care what you do, figure out how to get along with each other. If the Gentiles and the Jews can't figure out how to get along with each other in these early burgeoning Christian communities, we're not going to have any Christians. So figure it out, people. So for instance, if you want to be circumcised, that's great, but you have to follow the entire covenant. And if you don't want to circumcise, that's fine, because we have this other belief that Jesus is the Messiah, and that belief will take care of it for you. And those of you who still are circumcising your babies, go ahead and circumcise your babies. Follow the covenant. There's nothing wrong with that. But don't get mad at the people who don't want to follow it. So there's a lot of kind of going back and forth and making cases to make people be okay with the position that they're taking, and to understand that they're still welcome in the particular kind of community. So this passage in Romans is part of a longer argument that Paul is making about how the Jews should think about the Greeks, how the Jews should think about the Gentiles. And basically what he says is, we all know those Gentiles are kind of dirty, and we don't really like them very much, and they walk around naked in the gym, and we think that's weird, and they don't circumcise their babies, and they have all these other habits and stuff that we don't really like that much. Like, he clearly isn't a big fan of homosexuality. And so he says, so they did these really bad things, and this is all the bad stuff that happened to them. And then he turns around. What happens next is, but they're still believers, so you need to be nice to them. And this is the kind of rhetoric that happens in all of his kinds of passages. So this is one thing that is really important to think about. So when he says in 24, therefore God gave them over in the sinful desires of their hearts to sexual impurity for the degrading of their bodies with one another, etc., etc. This is about what happened when the Greeks, before Jesus came, weren't actually thinking about God. So there are bad consequences, according to Paul, for not doing that. So because of this, God gave them over to their shameful lusts. Let them do that. Even their women exchanged natural relations for unnatural ones. In the same way, the men abandoned natural relations with women and were enslaved with lust for one another. Men committed indecent acts with other men and received themselves in due penalty for their perversion. It's pretty clear Paul is not happy with this. The thing that's really interesting about this is the way that Paul uses the idea of natural relations. What's kind of fascinating here is that this is 27. Romans 1:27 is the only passage in the Bible that could be suggested to have anything to do with lesbian sex. But the challenge here is that the exchange of natural relations for unnatural ones for women could mean a bunch of things. It could mean having sex in an unauthorized sexual position. It could be having non-procreative sex. So you know what all those are, and you can think of it. There could be lots of things that could mean exchanging natural for unnatural, because the only definition of natural is sex to have a baby. And we all know that people do more sex acts than that. So even in this passage, it's not entirely clear, at least for women, what Paul is talking about. With regard to the men, because of some other things in the biblical text, a number of scholars have suggested that this may well be a referral to male prostitution more than it is a referral to other kinds of homosexuality. I'm not wed to that interpretation in any way. I think Paul's pretty clear. He's not a fan. So there are some things that I think we need to kind of think about, the negotiation between the Gentiles and the Jewish world, where there are lots of disagreements. And in fact, I think the most persuasive argument about this is that Paul raises the issue of homosexuality because it's a kind of point on which his Roman community agrees that there are Gentiles in the Roman community as well as Jews in the Roman community who find homosexuality to be a problem. And so he brings up something that both sides can agree on so that he can get them to agree on the more contentious issue, which is whether or not they should eat with each other and circumcise their young. So it becomes kind of a straw man for him to kind of get everybody on the same page, which I suppose is neither here nor there in the argument if you want to think about it. And further on, Paul ends up criticizing the Jewish Christians for passing judgment on the Gentiles who do this. So there is a kind of sense that everybody is falling short of the glory of God. It's not just these people, it's everybody. And so you need to kind of pay attention to that issue. No, you can't use this as something to bash people over the head with because everybody's fallen short here, people, no matter what you're doing. Paul was pretty clear about that. He also uses this language that he uses, paraphysikin, is a Greek phrase that, again, back to the idea of unnatural, it's about, when it's used in other places, it's about something unexpected or out of the ordinary. It is not a phrase that is about sin. And so an offense against the way things should be, it's a little fuzzy, I have to say. But I do know that there are passages in the New Testament where God is described as paraphysikin, that is, out of the ordinary and against nature. Because God stands up and outside of nature. It's not in nature, right? So those kinds of contexts suggest perhaps a little bit of a different flavor for what it is that Paul's talking about here and what it is that he's doing in that passage. Now, the other passages in the New Testament are these lists of things, the people who aren't going to inherit the kingdom of God. They show up over and over again. There's one in Corinthians, there's one in Timothy. There's a bunch of them in the Old Testament too, so this is kind of a carryover from the Old Testament. And here's one of those cases where this phrase, homosexual offenders, is one of those places where these words here don't mean homosexual. One of the ways that we know how ancient language means or what it means is we look for other texts where these phrases are found, where these words are found, and they're just not found in any other texts of the time, which makes it very, very difficult to interpret. The word Malachi is periodically, forms of it are periodically attached to things like cloth. So particularly soft cloth, for instance. So the idea is here that it's about soft men. And, you can make whatever you want out of that. We fall into certain stereotypes that we might have. Arsenoketai is a word that biblical scholars are still struggling with. The most likely is that it's about male prostitutes. But, again, we just don't know yet. We just don't have enough documents to know what that actually means. So to translate that as homosexual is a little dicey. Because that's not really what it means. We don't know what it means. You can assume that's what it means, but you would assume it means a whole bunch of things. But that's how it often gets translated, again, because of ancient traditions of translation. but you can't really use them in that sense to talk about that. Okay, so just to summarize, not very many passages in the Bible that talk about homosexuality. And I think it's really important, whatever you're going to believe about this, that you have some sense of the kind of historical and cultural context in which those passages find themselves. There are lots and lots of passages in the Bible that speak of the dignity of all human beings, that focus on love, that focus on community building, community harmony, all of those kinds of things. And so, part of it is how do we understand what's going on in the Bible? What do we take to be the things that we're going to pay the most attention to? And, everybody says, oh, well, you should pay attention to everything in the Bible all the time. It's all important. And yes and no. For instance, there's nothing in the Bible. This is my favorite. There are two great instances about this. There's nothing in the Bible against slavery. In fact, the biblical world is one where there is an assumption that slavery happens, that it exists. It's in a little different form than what we're used to thinking about in terms of slavery in the U.S. But there's nothing. Jesus even has parables about masters and slaves. And at a certain point in our cultural world, we decided that those passages, we were going to say, well, those are nice historical documents about what it was like to live at the time. But we're not going to pay attention to those anymore because we don't think that slavery is good. We're going to pay attention to other ideas about what it means to be human. The other issue is about women. Lot could give away his daughters instead of the strangers. Who would think about that as being a valid way to think about it? I remember when I was a little girl and I first heard this story, I said to my dad, would you give me away if that happened? It's an appalling thing for a little girl to read. Oh, look, in the Bible it says that they should give you away instead of some stranger. That did not make me feel good. Or welcomed or, thought of highly or any of that stuff. But we have come to a point in our culture where a lot of the ways the Bible thinks about women as property are not things that we think about anymore. We don't think about women in that way. There are a few holdovers, like, giving away brides at weddings and stuff like that. But generally, we have decided that those kinds of ideas are not really ideas that we're going to go gung-ho with. So we make decisions about what we're going to highlight in the biblical text and what we're not. And I think homosexuality is one of those cases where, you can choose to highlight what you want to highlight about it. And it's always good to have as much information as you can. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. We're going to have some Hill for another 15 minutes here to do some Q&A. So if anyone would like to ask some questions, please raise your hand, and I'll just let you call them up. Answer questions. Right?
I just noticed in the beginning part, the Leviticus thing, it was very specific about sexual relations with an animal or sexual relations with your neighbor, but then it gets really subtle about lie with a man as you would a woman.
Mm-hmm.
Is that, are there other translations about that, or is that actually very different between the two passages?
That's the kind of, I've never seen a different, well, actually, I think there is a different translation in one of the books I use in one of my classes, but I don't know that's usually the translation. I don't know what the more literal translation of that is. But it doesn't, what it says is don't lie with a man as though he is a woman. That's what it says. So you can think about what that prohibition is and how they're thinking about that just from that. It is subtle in that way because I think they were thinking about it subtly. Go ahead.
I was going to ask, as a person who teaches history and as a historian, do you think there are times in history where there's always a group that's getting ridiculed and persecuted?
Absolutely.
And,
Yes.
you know, it might be based on race, it might be based on sexuality, and I think, like, I don't know where I'm going with this, but I think that, like, you know, information, like, when people are informed, they're less likely to turn to that.
I think that's true, and I also think that, you know, we live in a world where there are power dynamics, and there are always power dynamics. And some of those power dynamics are good, and some of them are not. And if you look at the history of the world, looking at power dynamics, you find out a lot of things, right? I mean, all of history is written by the people who won the battles, right? So if you try to get at the people who didn't win, you're going to get a really different perspective on what's going on. But we don't have those voices in a lot of context because they were simply wiped out, right? So I think it's a subtle and important thing to do to remember that whatever story we tell about history is always a story from a particular kind of perspective. So I'm really clear that I'm giving a particular kind of perspective here that is countered by lots of other people who have different perspectives on these texts, from their theological backgrounds, from other kinds of historical stuff. I mean, there's all sorts of ways that you can think about any text, right? So that's what I would say to that. But yeah, I don't know of any time in history where there hasn't been somebody who gets ridiculed for some reason in some way. I think it would be very interesting to try to have a non-hierarchical context, but then you don't get anything done. Right? You got to have leaders. You got to get something done. Leaders usually end up having power. But, you know, you can work that out in ways that don't necessarily squelch other people who aren't invested in what's going on. But that rarely happens in history, I think. Other questions?
A comment followed by a question.
Mm-hmm.
Comment being, I don't recall ever reading anything about homosexuality in any of the other Gospels, in the non-canonical.
There's nothing. Jesus never says a word.
He doesn't.
No. There's
I
nothing.
don't mean the canonical Gospels.
Right. In any of them. No. In any of them, no.
That's
I don't think so.
The question, though, is if we go back to the earliest scholars, if you will, of Christianity, Origen or Tertullian, did they have anything to say?
Oh, yeah. Who is it? It's a really, really excellent book that I think is in the back of the pamphlet by it's a book on the history of sodomy, and it talks about how it's Mark. I'm just gonna miss it right here. Who's got a copy of the pamphlet? I can read it really quickly. These names are going to escape me when I try to find them. Oh, it's not in here. What's his name? He teaches at Harvard. But he wrote a book on the history of the idea of sodomy, and he kind of goes through all of the early Christian fathers who spend an enormous amount of time on this particular issue.
Well, it seems like by the time you get to Augustine, yeah, it's big. But,
Yeah.
But the second century?
Probably less likely. See, the thing is that from the first to the, you know, in the second and third centuries, Christians are just trying to stay alive because they're getting persecuted constantly by the Romans because they won't worship the Roman gods, right? They're treasonous. So the real kind of doctrinal stuff in the Christian tradition doesn't really get going so much until you hit Ambrose and Augustine in the mid-4th century. And so, I mean, you have people like Tertullian and Irenaeus and some people like that. They're very interested in sex, these guys, because Paul believed that Jesus was coming again. So Paul has that great line in Corinthians, I wish you could all be like me, but if you have to get married, get married. Better to marry than burn with passion, but I wish you could all stay like me, which is celibate. And the reason he said that was he's thinking to himself, well, you know, all these worldly things like marriage, children, etc., they're very distracting. And if Jesus is coming back in my lifetime, we need to be preparing. We need to be praying. We need to be focusing on our spiritual self and not dealing with all these worldly, strange things. When the world doesn't end or change radically, the early Christians have to kind of rethink, what is it exactly that we're doing here? They end up forming themselves to look a lot more like Roman culture than they did at the beginning, when there were women who led the churches and all of that kind of stuff. And they became obsessed with the sexual issue, primarily because of Paul and celibacy. So they became quite obsessed with, well, how do we do this properly? Oh, okay, so, we got this problem. We got to have sex because we got to have babies, because we got to have, we're not going to have any Christians if we don't have any babies, right? So we got to do that, but we're not, but celibacy is good because it allows you to focus wholly on your life on your life as a Christian, and we don't want people to not focus on their lives as Christians. How do we negotiate that? The church has an enormous problem dealing with that issue, celibacy versus sexuality, throughout, all the way through. We're still having those issues. So that particular dynamic is in Christianity from the beginning, partially because of that drive to remain celibate. That's why you find so much monasticism in the Middle Ages, is that it was very popular to just, go off and not get married and not have children and devote your life to God, because that's what was seen as the best model of the Christian life. So, yeah, Christianity is a little obsessed with these things. Other questions?
You have something on page 17 that says Boswell argues Christianity. That sounds interesting.
Yep. That's the earliest book. John Boswell's book on Christianity, homosexuality, and social tolerance is one of the earliest books that talked about homosexuality in the Christian tradition. So he actually later wrote a book on arguing that there were, in fact, same-sex marriages between monks and stuff. I'm a little skeptical, but,
But he says Christianity was indifferent to it in the 12th century?
Well, I think that might be a little bit of an overstatement. I think, you'll find he makes the claim.
Oh, okay.
I think that you will find pockets of indifference and non-indifference in various kind of versions of Christianity throughout Western culture. You can find, so we have, for instance, in Greek culture, we have Plato's Symposium, which basically says that the love between an older man and a younger man is the highest form of love ever possible, right? But you have people in Greek culture who don't agree with that. So there are texts in Greek culture that would suggest that that's not true. So you're always going to find a variety of opinions on these things in any given culture at any given time, I think. I wouldn't really necessarily make sweeping a generalization about that. I think it's an interesting book, which is why I put it in. Other questions? Please.
What do you think about the difference between purity and cleanness?
And what?
And cleanness?
Purity and cleanliness are very closely related to each other. I think we have different ideas about what those are, but in the context of the Hebrew Bible, purity and cleanliness are pretty much synonymous. Although purity is a bigger category than just cleanliness in the way that we think about it in terms of like physical cleanliness.
So do you think it's okay for those who marry or to say I'm not virgin to wear white clothes on the wedding day?
Oh, so you're going to bring that into the white thing. Well, I don't know. I don't have an opinion about that, actually. I think people make choices for all sorts of reasons. The white wedding dress as a symbol of purity is a fairly recent historical phenomenon. Women used to get married in black. So, I think most of the time today we know that women choose white gowns and they may or may not. They're probably not actually virgins most of the time. That would be my suspicion. I may be wrong about that, but that's my suspicion. But because it's a cultural, that's why women still have their fathers give them away. I mean, talk about an ownership issue. Hi, I'm going to give you away to your husband to take care of you now. Even that language suggests that he used to own you. He has the capacity to give you away. So those kind of holdovers, we keep them because we think that they, are tradition and stuff. We don't necessarily think about what they're signifying or what they actually mean when we do them. Or maybe we do, and that's exactly what we want to have happen.
I wonder if you've read the European biblically.
No, I haven't. I've heard him talk, though. Very interesting. I haven't read it, though. The guy who decided to try to live by
all the laws.
All of the laws in the Bible for an entire year. It was quite difficult in our modern society.
I think part of the confusion with interpreting the morality of homosexuality has to do with belief or disbelief in the Bible being a text given literally by God, as being his direct words.
I'm sure that could play into it. I actually, here's what I think, fundamentally. I think the Bible can be used to support whatever position you want to support on whatever issue you want to use it for. And I don't think that's a bad thing. Because that means that this is a rich document that has all sorts of ideas in it. And it's why people still read it, because it's a rich document that has all sorts of ideas in it. And I think that, the challenge was kind of saying this is a document given by God, and there are no contradictions, and there are no challenges in it, and there are no things that don't agree with each other. Is that there are things that don't disagree with each other, because the text, well, people wouldn't necessarily think of the text because it expands such a huge time period. And, one of the things to say about that is, maybe God wanted humans to have to struggle with these things. I mean, why not? So, that could be the kind of sense of saying, okay, so God understands that humans are going to be the way they are because God made humans the way God made humans, and so part of what we're going to do as humans, if we believe in what this text says, is that we are going to struggle with trying to understand what the text says. And frankly, isn't that really what faith is supposed to be about? Is the struggle. And so, I'm fine with the struggle. I don't have any reason to think that the text should be extraordinarily clear on every possible topic. I think that the text generally, I would have to say that I would think, one of the things that I think kind of goes through the text is that in both the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament is a deep concern about the viability of communities. And not all communities, your particular community. Because God is mean to communities that aren't good to the people that he, in the Hebrew Bible, he's mean when those other communities are mean to his Israelites. He's not happy about that. So, I can see that throughout the text, that is one thing that's really important. There are other things too, but I think that's an important one.
We were talking about last seminar that there wasn't even a word homosexual before the 1800s.
Yeah.
So I was just wondering if the translation was in the Bible before that word.
Oh my gosh, what a very interesting question, to which I have no answer.
Maybe the King James from the 1700s,
Yeah. I don't know what it was. But you can go on BibleGateway.com and find, like, the Dewey Reams Bible. It might have it in there. Part of the problem is that some of some of the older Bibles don't even have some of these passages in them. But I don't know the answer to that. That would be something I should find out. Thanks for that. Sorry, I don't know.
Could you say on that the Bible didn't really have, I guess sexuality is like identities, sexual identities, like homosexual heterosexual don't really exist, and that it more just speaks about specific acts rather than about lifestyle or identity.
I'm not sure because really what I can say about that, I mean, you could say one general topic, which is this. The Bible really likes procreative sex acts. So whatever sex act is going to get you a baby, awesome. Other sex acts, even sex that isn't going to get you a baby, that's procreative, intentionally procreative, and doesn't get you a baby, not so good. So that's really the only thing you can say about the Bible and sex. I mean, there's a lot of sexual transgression in the Bible. Lot's daughters having sex with her father to keep the lineage going. There's all sorts of stuff going on in the Bible that we would find utterly and completely problematic today that kept lineages going that were crucial for the life of the Israelites, for instance. So I'm not sure that you can even make that statement so much, except for to say it likes procreative sex acts. All right, I can answer more questions, but it is past your time.
Yeah, I think we're just about out of time here.
Let me take that one more question, and we'll be done. Okay. Indeed, so there's another contradiction right there. I mean, the Song of Solomon, very controversial text in the biblical text because of this particular thing. And one of the reasons, we think it's about sex, but it's not specifically, it's very poetic and metaphorical, and you can read it in lots and lots of ways. So there's that particular issue as well. And there's also the difference between how ancient Israelites and how the Jewish tradition thinks about sexuality and sex, which is actually a little different than the way that the Christian tradition has thought about sex and sexuality and pleasure. So when I think about that, what I think is that generally Christian theologians didn't really spend a lot of time talking about the Song of Solomon, even though they could have if they wanted to look at pleasure. But pleasure is just not really something that either one of the traditions, so more in Judaism than Christianity, that people pay attention to. I mean, it's not until the 20th century at some point where the Catholic Church affirms, for instance, that married couples it's okay for married couples to have sex for other than procreative purposes. Really, I think it was like in the 70s or something, actually. So, that may be too late, but so there's still a pretty clear idea that sex is about procreation primarily. I mean, we don't tend to think that in the world that we live in, but theologically, that tends to be the strong position. All right, thanks.
Yep.